President Trump is calling on the CEO of one of Oregon's largest employers to resign.
Yeah, in a post on Truth Social, the president cited alleged ties of Intel's CEO to China, calling him highly conflicted and adding that he, quote, must resign immediately.
Now, this comes as Intel is struggling to find its footing in the AI landscape and is shedding jobs around the world, but especially here in Oregon.
Fox 12 investigative reporter Ezra Kaplan has been digging into what all this means and joins us now.
Intel CEO Lip-Bu Tan has only been on the job since March of this year, and his hiring came amidst turmoil, with the board ousting former CEO Pat Gelsinger just in December. At the time, an Intel board member noted that Tan would, quote, accelerate our turnaround. But right from the beginning, the CEO has faced scrutiny. In April, just 1 month after taking the role, Reuters reported that Tan had invested at least $200 million in hundreds of Chinese tech companies, some of which were linked to the Chinese military. Reuters was unable to determine at the time whether Tan still held those investments and said it found no evidence his investments were illegal. That reporting likely contributed to a letter sent just yesterday to the Intel Board of Directors from Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton. That letter read in part, Mr. Tan reportedly controls dozens of Chinese companies and has a stake in hundreds of Chinese advanced manufacturing and chip firms. At least 8 of these companies reportedly have ties to the Chinese People's Liberation Army. Senator Cotton is a noted China hawk, but in his letter, he importantly did not ask Intel to fire their CEO. He instead asked them to answer several questions about Tan's ties to a Chinese firm and a $140 million settlement by Cadence Design Systems, where Tan was previously the CEO. And that was to resolve federal charges that the company had sold chips to a Chinese military university. When I asked Intel for a comment on Trump's post, they did not directly address the president's call for the CEO to step down. In a statement, they said the company was committed to advancing U.S. security and are investing in the president's America First agenda, adding that they look forward to their continued engagement with the administration. All of this drama is just the most recent for the embattled company. Just last month, Intel laid off 15,000 workers, and in the past year and a half, the company has eliminated 5,400 jobs just here in Oregon. And part of the problem for Intel is figuring out where they fit in the age of AI. While other U.S.-based companies like NVIDIA are dominating the semiconductor field, they don't actually make or fabricate the chips themselves. They mostly rely on the Taiwanese company TSCM. But while Trump is going after the Intel CEO for alleged ties to China, he recently relaxed some technology export rules, allowing NVIDIA to send top-tier chips to China as the country works to build out its own AI infrastructure. And while Trump has a record of relaxing his positions on similar issues to this, it's unclear whether Intel has the political capital to wait this one out. Reporting in studio, Ezra Kaplan, Fox 12 Oregon.